Welcome back to the deep dive, everybody. Today we're tackling something pretty massive, and that is what it even means to think like philosophers when we're talking about mental disorder.
I like that. I like that a lot.
It's kind of like, forget the textbook definitions for a second and let's just ask the big questions like
Mm.
what is normal?
Right.
What is disordered? And how do our own values influence those judgments?
Absolutely. And I think, for the listener who wants to get a really solid grasp of this without getting completely overwhelmed, this deep dive is going to be like a guided tour through some seriously dense philosophical territory. We've gone deep into the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on mental disorder.
Oh, great source.
It's fantastic. It really represents a wide range of different philosophical viewpoints on the topic. And we've distilled it down to, like, the most important philosophical insights for you.
That's what we do.
Yeah, exactly. And our mission today, I think, is to really understand how philosophers have thought about and continue to think about mental disorder. Going beyond just simple biological or social explanations. We want to equip you to think like a philosopher about this.
So to kick us off, thinking like a philosopher, just the language around mental disorder already feels like, I don't know, a philosophical battleground. You've got mental disorder, you've got mental illness, you've got psychiatric disability, even mental difference. It's like the words themselves already kind of frame how we think about this.
Yeah, no, that's a really astute observation. And it speaks to the heart of conceptual analysis, which is a core part of philosophy, like how we
Right.
carve up the world with our language. And what's interesting from a philosophical point of view is that these different terms, they often reveal some pretty deep, often unacknowledged assumptions about mental disorder. Like, for example, the shift you mentioned from mental illness to mental disorder often signals an attempt, though not always consistent, to move away from those like immediate medical associations that come with the term illness.
Right.
It's like trying to avoid putting something in a strictly medical box.
And then you see cognitive being used kind of in place of mental a lot. And that, to me, seems like it's changing how we think about different aspects of the mind, the different parts of the mind.
Exactly. So if we connect this to broader philosophical ideas about the mind, this increasing emphasis on the cognitive reflects a shift away from older models of the mind where you had like separate faculties.
Right.
Like the emotions were separate from the thoughts, were
Yeah.
separate from the perceptions. Now emotions are like very much seen as cognitive states.
Right.
And then you get things like mental and behavioral disorders, sometimes even just behavioral disorders, which signals another important philosophical shift. It sort of broadens the scope to include things like addictions.
Right.
And it often prioritizes symptoms that can be observed and measured
Right.
rather than solely relying on someone's like subjective experience. So even before we define what a mental disorder is, even the language we use to talk about it carries a lot of philosophical baggage, you could say.
So the language itself gives us different lenses to look through, which I know you, the listener, are always keen to see.
Yeah.
Now, another key philosophical tension that was highlighted in this Stanford Encyclopedia entry is that between sort of our everyday common sense understanding of mental disorder, what they call folk psychology,
Yeah.
and the more scientific approach of, medical psychiatry. And it feels like these two don't always mesh.
They often don't. And this is a really fertile ground for philosophical scrutiny, I think. Think about those hysterical syndromes from the past. So these were like seemingly physical problems, things like paralysis or pain, but they were often categorized as mental disorders.
Right.
And this kind of blurring of the lines between what counts as mental and what counts as physical really shows the limitations of our everyday understanding. And it poses a problem when we try to create more like rigorous scientific categories. So, from a philosophical point of view, we're asking like, how reliable is our sort of intuitive sense of what constitutes a mental disorder?
Right. So is our common sense understanding a solid foundation for scientifically categorizing these really complex issues?
That's a great question. And philosophers like Dominic Murphy, he's one that comes to mind, raise some really interesting questions about that. He argues that our folk psychology, while obviously useful for navigating daily life, might not accurately reflect the actual underlying causal structure of mental disorders that science aims to uncover.
Right.
It's kind of like saying our everyday understanding of how a car works might be good enough to like drive it,
Sure.
but it wouldn't necessarily allow us to diagnose like a complex engine problem, right?
Right.
So without like a more systematic and principled way of defining what we're even talking about, there's a risk that our classifications of mental disorder might be based on kind of outdated or even just inaccurate folk psychological categories.
I see.
And philosophically, this really challenges us to think carefully about the relationship between our intuitive understanding and scientific explanation.
Right, but I can see the counterargument there, which is that surely our lived experience, our common language, holds some value.
Oh, absolutely. And there are philosophers who emphasize that, like quite strongly. People like Bruld and Radovich, they've argued for the practical importance of maintaining this category of mental disorder as it is, like commonly understood.
Mm-hmm.
They argue that this shared understanding has provided a valuable framework for research and clinical practice. And they're concerned that if we radically redefine mental disorder based on abstract scientific ideals, we might lose that shared understanding.
Right.
And we might even blur important professional boundaries.
Right.
And then there's also, the philosophical concern about the authority of medical psychiatry, the fears of overdiagnosis, the potential influence of the pharmaceutical industry. So as philosophers, we have to really weigh the desire for scientific accuracy against these practical realities of how these conditions are understood and treated in the real world.
Right. So it feels like, we're constantly trying to balance or reconcile different ways of understanding the same phenomena. Now, the Stanford entry also laid out some really fundamental philosophical divisions in how we analyze mental disorder.
Yeah.
Can you walk us through those different stances that philosophers take?
Absolutely. Yeah. So if we want to analyze the different ways that philosophers approach mental disorder, we can identify a few key areas where there are significant disagreements. So first, there's this distinction between what we might call naturalist or objectivist accounts.
Right.
These accounts, they try to describe mental disorders as discoverable entities in the world, ideally in a value-free way, sort of like how we study any other natural phenomenon.
Right.
But on the other hand, you have these normative or evaluativist analyses, which argue that our understanding of mental disorder is inherently shaped by values, by what we consider to be good or bad or normal or abnormal.
Right.
Then there's a divide between what we might call revisionists, who are more willing to fundamentally rethink or even discard our current concepts of mental disorder, in light of new knowledge.
Yeah.
And then there are the conservatives who believe that there's value in retaining at least some of the traditional categories.
Right.
And then finally, you have a methodological split, where some philosophers think that we primarily understand mental disorder through scientific research, so neuroscience, psychology, those fields. And then others think that it's more about conceptual analysis, examining the language, the social and cultural norms that shape our understanding. So these are some of the major philosophical lenses that we can use to analyze this topic.
Right. Okay, that gives us a really good framework for thinking about, all these different approaches. Now, let's look at the mental and mental disorder. And the entry talked about how in the past, the absence of physical symptoms used to be a defining feature.
Right.
But now that's been kind of recognized as a problem.
Yeah.
So philosophically speaking, how is the mental being understood today?
That's a really interesting, tricky philosophical puzzle. So one way to think about the mental draws on these older ideas about the mind having different capacities, or what they used to call faculties, right? Things like perception, affect, emotions, and cognition, thinking, right?
Right.
And from this perspective, a disorder is considered mental if the underlying cause involves some kind of disruption in these psychological faculties. So, for example, you could see hallucinations as a disorder of perception.
Right.
Or you could see extreme highs and lows in mood as a problem with affect regulation. Or you could see delusions as a disorder of cognitive processing. And philosopher Jerome Wakefield, he's been really influential in developing this kind of view.
Yeah, and I think, that aligns with how we often intuitively think about mental health, right?
Yes.
As relating to our kind of internal experiences and how we process the world. But the entry also talked about looking at external symptoms and how that fits into the picture.
Yeah.
So philosophically, how does that work?
Yeah. So another philosophical perspective kind of shifts the focus away from those internal mechanisms to the way that these issues manifest in someone's life and their social functioning, right?
Right.
So you have thinkers like Rashed and Bingham. They emphasize that what makes something a mental disorder isn't necessarily this hidden internal glitch, but rather its impact on someone's ability to function in their social and personal life. So
Right.
if someone's anxiety, for example, prevents them from holding down a job or like maintaining relationships, that's kind of the primary reason why it might be considered a disorder.
Right.
And then you have these more like integrated biopsychosocial accounts, and they try to combine both internal factors and external symptoms.
Right.
And, even the diagnostic criteria in things like the DSM can be seen as reflecting this two-pronged approach, right?
Yeah.
They look at both like underlying psychological processes and the resulting impact on someone's life.
Right. So it sounds like each of these ways of understanding the mental has its own set of like limitations if you think about it philosophically.
Absolutely. Accounts that focus on internal psychological processes, they often rely on like theoretical constructs that we don't fully understand yet.
Right.
Essentially, they're saying, well, we believe that there are these underlying mental mechanisms at play, even though we haven't fully identified them,
Uh-huh.
which philosophically can be like a bit problematic because it could lead to like circular reasoning or classifications based on like speculation rather than on like solid empirical evidence.
Right.
And then, on the other hand, if you focus solely on observable symptoms, that also has its own challenges. Because, what might be considered a dysfunctional mental symptom in one cultural context might be like totally acceptable or even valued in another cultural context.
Right.
And as philosophers, we also need to be careful about distinguishing mental disorder from like normal responses to difficult life circumstances.
Sure.
Or, even just behaviors that deviate from social norms but aren't actually harmful.
Right. Right.
So we need to be careful.
So this really highlights, I think, the philosophical difficulty in even like defining the mental. The entry touches on some philosophical perspectives on what distinguishes the mental. Like, what are some of the core ideas that philosophers have come up with?
Yeah, so there's a range of ideas, throughout the history of philosophy.
Mm-hmm.
Some philosophers emphasize the connection to consciousness
Right.
and like our sense of self as individuals, our sense of personhood. Others focus on this notion of intentionality. This is like a big philosophical term.
Right.
But essentially it means that mental states are always about something.
Right.
Like your thought about lunch is about lunch.
Yeah.
It has this like aboutness.
Right.
So some philosophers argue that this intentionality is like the core feature of the mental. Then you have the idea of reason's responsiveness.
Mm.
The way our thoughts and actions are guided by reasons.
Right.
And some see that as central to understanding mental disorder.
Right.
And philosophers like Campbell, Thornton, Summers, and Sinnott Armstrong, they've all kind of explored these ideas.
Yeah.
And we ask ourselves, do any of these characteristics like really give us a clear and consistent way to define what we mean by the mental?
Right. Now, where does cognitive psychology fit into this philosophical discussion about the mental? It seems like that field has really, I don't know, reshaped how we even think about the mind.
It really has, yeah. Cognitive psychology, with its focus on like information processing, computation, and representation, it's kind of shifted the focus away from some of those traditional philosophical concepts of the mental.
Right.
Instead of talking about like a distinct mental realm, the emphasis is now on understanding cognitive processes,
Right.
which, as we said, now often include things like emotions.
Right.
So while cognitive psychology has been incredibly influential in like empirical research on the mind, for us as philosophers, it's important to remember that our everyday understanding of like cognitive capacities, things like beliefs, desires, that's still the starting point for a lot of these scientific investigations.
Right.
And we need to consider like what are the implications of this for our understanding of personhood, our understanding of agency. Mental disorders are attributed to individuals, to persons, but philosophically, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're reducible to purely physical or neuroscientific explanations. So you get concepts like weak physicalism or biopsychosocial models. And they try to bridge this gap by suggesting that, yes, mental processes are ultimately grounded in the brain,
Right.
but they're not entirely reducible to its physical workings. It's sometimes described as a form of like naturalistic dualism.
Okay. So mental is clearly like a really complex philosophical concept with lots of layers.
It is.
Now, let's look at the second part of our term, disorder. The entry points out the huge range of conditions that we classify as mental disorders. So philosophically, how do we even begin to make sense of what constitutes a disorder given this like wide variety?
Yeah, that's a huge question. And this is where we really get into some of the like core philosophical debates about mental disorder. One like long-standing approach, which goes all the way back to ancient philosophy, is to link disorder with like a lack of inner harmony
Right.
or disunity in the mind and a breakdown of rationality.
Right.
So think about like the ancient Greek idea of eudaimonia, flourishing, this like state of psychological well-being. And they thought you could achieve this through like a balanced and rational soul.
Mm-hmm.
So from this perspective, mental disorder is seen as a disruption of this inner harmony, this descent into irrationality.
Right.
And that idea, has been picked up by later thinkers like Michel Foucault in his work on the Age of Reason.
Mm.
Even today, our intuitive understanding of mental disorder often associates it with like disturbed thinking, especially in conditions like psychosis.
Right.
And the concept of rationality, there's a really important role in like legal assessments of mental capacity, responsibility, all of that.
Right. But the entry also kind of highlighted some modern challenges to this idea of irrationality being like the defining feature of mental disorder.
Yeah.
So as philosophers, what should we make of these challenges?
Yeah, they're really important. I think findings from behavioral economics, for example, have shown that even people who are considered normal often exhibit biases
Right.
and make decisions that aren't like perfectly rational.
Right.
And this kind of blurs the line between what we might consider normal human fallibility and like clinical irrationality. And then you have research on positive illusions. And that suggests that certain forms of like slightly unrealistic optimism or self-enhancement might actually be like beneficial for mental well-being.
Right.
So this really forces us to ask, like, should a simple lack of perfect rationality be the like sole criteria for defining disorder?
Right.
And as philosophers, I think we need to think very critically about our underlying assumptions about mental health, the role that reason plays within it. Like, what kind of rationality are we talking about? And is perfect rationality even like a desirable or achievable state?
That's a really good point. And it's like our very definition of mental health then involves these philosophical assumptions about what is desirable, what is good. Now, another prominent way that we kind of conceptualize disorder is through the lens of suffering and disability.
Absolutely.
And the DSM and the ICD, they both emphasize distress or disability as kind of key indicators.
Yeah.
So what are the philosophical implications of thinking about disorder that way?
Right. So this perspective kind of shifts the focus away from like purely internal states to the lived experience of the individual and the impact of the condition on their ability to like function in the world.
Yeah.
So the idea here is that a mental disorder is characterized by significant personal distress or impairment in important areas of life. While some psychodynamic approaches might suggest that there's always some underlying distress. Even when it's not consciously reported, the emphasis here is generally on observable suffering or like functional limitations. And philosopher Tim Bolton, he has this distress impairment analysis, which explicitly combines these two.
Right.
And this resonates, I think, with our everyday understanding of why someone might seek help.
Right.
It's because they're suffering.
Yeah.
Or they're struggling to cope with daily life.
But the entry also pointed out that, there are conditions like mania, where distress might not be a primary feature.
Yeah.
So how does that then philosophically challenge this suffering and disability definition?
Yeah, it raises some really important questions about, is suffering really universal? Is it a defining characteristic of all mental disorders?
Right.
To account for these conditions where distress might be absent, some definitions introduce this idea of an increased risk of future suffering or disability.
Right.
But as philosophers, we should be cautious about equating risk with disorder itself.
Right.
Because distress, is a normal part of the human experience. So philosophically, we have to grapple with this question of when does like normal sadness or anxiety become pathological?
Right.
And the debate around the grief exclusion in the DSM really highlights this challenge.
Yeah.
Are we medicalizing normal human emotions?
Right.
And it's also crucial to consider that distress can be caused by the disorder itself,
Right.
but also by the stigma and discrimination associated with having a diagnosis.
Right. Right.
So it's like hard to disentangle
Yeah.
which one is like really part of the disorder itself.
Yeah.
While there's hope for biological markers that might like provide a more objective measure, ultimately interpreting those markers is still going to involve value judgments.
Right.
Now, what's interesting is that in some cases, the psychological symptoms themselves can actually constitute the disorder.
Right.
So take depression, for example. Persistent low mood, loss of interest. These aren't just symptoms of a disorder. They're central to what defines it. And these network models I mentioned earlier, they suggest that symptoms can even become a disorder
Hmm.
through these kind of like complex feedback loops without necessarily pointing to a single underlying cause.
Right.
So philosophically, this challenges the idea that there's always like one single essential disorder entity.
Uh-huh.
And then finally, you have these disability-focused accounts of disorder, and they emphasize impairment in like social and occupational functioning
Mm.
as the key criterion. So this approach draws on like work done in the context of physical disability by philosophers like Oliver and Polvora.
Mm.
And it highlights, how mental disorders can create real barriers
Right.
to participation in society.
Yeah.
But, as philosophers, we also need to consider, are the analogies between mental and physical disabilities like really complete?
Right.
And how does mental disorder differ from just deviance from social norms? Right?
Yeah. Yeah. So it seems like every attempt to really define disorder kind of runs into these philosophical hurdles.
It does.
Now, the entry discusses this idea of dysfunction and like two-stage analyses, and they focus on Wakefield's harmful dysfunction concept.
Yeah.
Can you break that down from a philosophical perspective?
Sure. So Wakefield's harmful dysfunction analysis is an attempt to provide a more kind of naturalistic definition of mental disorder. He argues that a mental disorder involves a dysfunction in some internal, bodily or neural mechanism,
Right.
something that can be described objectively by science in principle, and that this dysfunction is also harmful. And the harmfulness is judged according to societal standards. So it leads to a breakdown in the individual's like social or personal functioning. So the idea is to combine this objective biological component with like a subjective judgment of harm.
Okay. And what are some of the philosophical critiques of this seemingly like objective approach?
Yeah, so philosophically, there are a number of challenges to this view. So those network models we talked about earlier, they question whether symptomatic dysfunctions always stem from these like identifiable breakdowns in like specific biological mechanisms. They
Yeah.
might emerge from like more complex interactions, within a network of symptoms.
Right.
So that challenges this very notion of a kind of localized dysfunction.
Right.
Then you have this madness as strategy account. It draws on evolutionary theory, and it offers a really radical alternative. It suggests that some mental states that we label as disorders might actually be like adaptive responses
Mm.
or even creative problem-solving mechanisms in certain contexts.
Mm.
So this directly challenges the idea that these states are inherently dysfunctional.
Interesting. So even an attempt to kind of ground a definition in biology still faces this like heavy philosophical scrutiny.
Yes, absolutely.
It really highlights the difficulty of separating like objective description from value judgments.
Yeah.
The entry then goes on to mention a whole bunch of like formal definitions of disorder
Mm-hmm.
that have been proposed by different philosophers.
Yeah.
Are there any like philosophical insights we can gain from looking at this like wide variety of attempts?
I think so, definitely. While none of these formal definitions, proposed by people like Boris, Wakefield, Girton, Culver, Resnick, Parvon, Sue, Garçon,
Mm-hmm.
none of them have achieved like widespread acceptance.
Right.
But looking at them from a philosophical point of view, I think, reveals the different priorities and assumptions that underlie various attempts to define mental disorder.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, some definitions prioritize biological normalcy, while others focus on social functioning or the presence of suffering. And the critiques of each definition are also philosophically illuminating. They point to these fundamental issues like, is a definition truly value-free? How does it define its terms of reference? Does it make problematic assumptions about evolution or culture? Is it too vague or too narrow?
Right.
The fact that there are so many different attempts and so many criticisms, I think, suggests that philosophers are increasingly recognizing that a single all-encompassing definition of mental disorder might just be impossible,
Right.
just given the diverse nature of all the conditions that we try to categorize as such.
Right. And this really emphasizes, I think, the value of acting as philosophers here, where it's not about finding a single, like, right answer.
Right.
It's about understanding the different ways of, like, framing the question
Yeah.
and the limitations of each perspective. Now, shifting gears again, the entry also talks about this experiential dimension of mental disorder,
Yeah.
and they highlight what are called phenomenological approaches.
Yeah.
So what does this philosophical perspective add to our understanding?
The phenomenological approach philosophically,
Hmm.
really emphasizes the importance of first-person experience,
Okay.
when trying to understand mental disorder.
Right.
Because so many of the symptoms are fundamentally subjective,
Right.
right? Like how someone feels, what they perceive, the individual's own account has this unique kind of importance. Unlike in other areas of medicine where you might have like really clear biological markers to confirm a diagnosis.
Mm.
We don't always have that with mental disorder. So phenomenology, which focuses on the study of consciousness and subjective experience, I think, offers a really valuable lens for understanding these conditions.
So instead of just like looking at outward behavior or trying to find like the biological cause,
Yeah.
phenomenology is trying to get at the lived experience of these conditions. It's like, what kind of insights can that give us as
Yeah,
philosophers?
so phenomenological analysis really tries to get at like the specific ways in which experiences of like the self, time, perception, and emotion are kind of altered in mental disorder.
Mm.
And this is particularly important, I think, in conditions like psychosis.
Right.
And the hermeneutical approach, which emphasizes interpretation, understanding meaning. It's also important here.
Okay.
It recognizes that, human experiences have meaning within a particular context. Philosophically, this leads to different ways of like studying the mind. So some prioritize subjective experience, others emphasize more objective empirical methods. So phenomenologically, we might ask,
Yeah.
how is the experience of a delusion different from like a strongly held belief?
Right.
Or how does like the sense of time change in depression or in mania?
Yeah.
And these are questions that like brain scans alone can't really answer.
Right. Now, are there philosophical debates within phenomenology itself about how to best understand mental disorder?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
There's debate about whether, the subjective experiences we see in conditions like psychosis are fundamentally different
Okay.
from typical psychological experiences,
Oh.
or whether they're like on a continuum.
Right.
And philosopher Samaji Varga, he proposes this idea of a psychiatric hermeneutics.
Okay.
And this recognizes that we're dealing with like self-interpreting beings in a very specific context
Right.
of mental disorder.
Hmm.
And while there might be disagreements on like the specifics of the method, there is this general agreement, I think, that understanding psychopathology, it requires us to really explore that individual's lived experience.
Right.
And there's also been really interesting work trying to kind of bridge phenomenology with empirical science.
Okay.
So you have people like Matthew Radcliffe, he's doing work on the role of affect and how it shapes our like understanding of the world.
Mm-hmm.
And this has led to what they call phenomenological clinical neuroscience. And then you have the embodied and enactive approaches to cognition, and they emphasize how, our actual perceptual experiences,
Uh-huh.
our embodied interactions with the world,
Right.
how they shape our mental processes and potentially contribute to disorder. So philosophically, this kind of moves us away from this picture of the mind as this like detached entity,
Right.
and it highlights the importance of our lived embodied experience.
I see. It's fascinating how phenomenology really brings that like human perspective to the forefront. Now, the entry shifts to talk about kind of politics and values inherent in like classifying mental disorders.
Yeah.
As philosophers, why is it so important to consider these aspects?
Philosophically, I think it's really important because it reminds us that our understanding of mental disorder isn't just this like neutral, objective, scientific endeavor.
Right.
The very act of classifying conditions as disorders,
Yeah.
distinguishing between different types,
Yeah.
it involves value judgments.
Yeah.
And it has really significant social and political implications.
Right.
While the DSM and the ICD, they aim for reliability and validity. They want to be accurate and consistent.
Sure.
But they've faced like considerable criticism for their underlying assumptions, their methodology and their potential to actually reflect and reinforce societal biases.
So it seems like this idea of even achieving like a completely value-free classification is kind of a major point of philosophical debate.
Yeah, it's huge. Critics argue that the very goals and purposes of like psychiatric classification are inherently tied to our values, right? Host speaker.